And that jarring cacophony, ending with Edmund Butt's score for An Adventure in Space and Time, tells you you're listening to the Power of Three podcast. I'm Kenny Smith. Today we're taking a look at another release from the Black Archive series, published by our friends at Obverse Books over in Edinburgh. Today's book is an archive special, and it's been written by David Rolinson. So, what can we tell you about An Adventure in Space and Time? The following programme is based on actual events. It's important to remember, however, that you can't rewrite history, not one line, except perhaps when you embark on an adventure in space and time. The back cover tells us, in 1966, William Hartnell is about to film his final scenes as Doctor Who. Having helped establish the series as a smash hit for the BBC, he is not keen to go, but ill health means he simply can't continue. Tracing the story of the series' creation, from Sidney Newman's first suggestion of a new science fiction series to Hartnell leaving the role, An Adventure in Space and Time is more than just a biopic of William Hartnell. It's the story of the creation of a television legend. In this double-length extended special archive, David Rolinson examines everything connected with this Doctor Who special, from the idents before it starts to the moments after it finishes, and everything in between. So yes, it's a bumper volume, 270 pages, and why don't we take a wee look at the cover? It's got that beautiful design that they always use on the Black Archive, where they've got the top 2/3 of the page dedicated to an unusual image, and in the bottom third we get the title and a main graphic. In this case we've got, well, it's a yellowish colour rather than the usual black, and it's a fascinating collection of doodles in the top half and what appears to be a photocopier or some kind of printing device at the bottom. So yes, it's rather unusual and rather different, and as we're about to discover, the book itself is rather glorious.
I'm David Rolinson. I wrote the archive special An Adventure in Space and Time. It's partly a book about the docudrama An Adventure in Space and Time. It's partly a book about Doctor Who as a whole. So the book moves chronologically through the docudrama to discuss what it does and how it does it. But the book also sort of jumps off from that to look at issues raised by the docudrama. So I discussed Doctor Who, mostly the Hartnell era, but pretty much every era is covered in it at some stage. And also how we watch Doctor Who, how we engage with it, so trails, radio times listings, idents, novelisations. And it's about history, so the history of Doctor Who, how Doctor Who itself uses history, and also one of my favourite bits of An Adventure in Space and Time, the first, the disclaimer at the start, starts with this warning. It's a quotation from the Aztecs: "You can't rewrite history, not one line." I mean, starting a docudrama with that, I just think is lovely. So I want to explore that a bit. I suppose the quickest way to introduce it would be to just quote a line from it. During it I say, An Adventure in Space and Time is about the adventure of making Doctor Who and the adventure of watching Doctor Who. So I suppose the book is that and all.
It definitely is. It's fantastic. So when you first saw it, what do you remember about watching it for the first time?
Well, in the context of the 50th anniversary, it was all kind of one long sort of party. That's again why I was interested in that parallel with history and historians, because E.H. Carr kind of said around the time Doctor Who started that history is kind of written from the perspective of the present. So An Adventure in Space and Time is very much kind of that 50th anniversary, kind of selling Doctor Who as a global super brand. kind of looking backwards and forwards at the same time. What I didn't do when I watched it was I wasn't getting grumpy about all the things that have been changed and people who were missing and everything else, because I'd kind of written enough about docudrama to know how docudramas kind of work. I wasn't even annoyed by the fact that they have a bell ringing in the studio, which, in terms of multi-camera video studios didn't happen. I could kind of see they were finding creative solutions, trying to tell a story, trying to talk about how television drama was made, multi-camera studio drama was made in 1963 to an audience that wouldn't be familiar with it. So I was kind of impressed by the solutions to the problems that they would have had making it, really. But yeah, it's very much a kind of weirdly of a piece with Day of the Doctor. I kind of didn't really realise until I went back to them both, the kind of parallels between them. But that was the main thing, sort of the 50th anniversary kind of side of it.
Yeah, it's an unusual one for the Black Archive to do. So what was it that inspired you? Was it the fact that it was different? That's what made you think that's worth a look?
Well, I've known about the Black Archive since before it started. James Courier Smith sent me his manuscript of The Massacre, one of the first books, before it came out, and asked for feedback. I had very little feedback other than it's great. I kind of had a sort of set of grumpy notes in my head. Well, you better talk about Christopher Marlowe, and you better do this, and you better do that. And Jim had thought of all of them and done them really well. But unlike in academia, he still thanks me. In academia, you can do loads of work for people and not get a credit. And Jim credited me for basically going, yeah, it's great. But I thought I'd like to do one of these. But I also thought I'd better not do, because I've got other things to do. I'm supposed to be writing big books about docudrama and terrorism. I thought, but I want to do the Time Meddler. No, I want to do the Gunfighters. No, I want to do Remembrance, because then you could write about the rise of the far right in the 50s and 60s. And there's all kinds of stuff you could do with this. I went, no, I'm not going to let you. And then one day, bizarrely, it was on a street, walking down a street in Hove. I actually stopped in the street and said to the person next to me, I've been trying to work out, do I do a book about docudrama or do I do a book about Doctor Who? If I do an adventure in space and time, I'm doing both of them. I could kind of sell it at work as being a kind of stepping stone to my book on docudrama, but also I could really, really write about Doctor Who in quite a big way. So I raised that idea with Jim, and he contacted the other editors, because James Courier Smith was still involved at that point, editing some of the range. Ultimately, Stuart Douglas was the editor. It's very kind of him not to throw half the book out when it was finished. So I wrote this by trying not to write a Black Archive for a very long time, and now I feel it very silly because it's been 10 years and I could have done a couple. So that was my sort of my kind of way into it. I have written a few academic pieces about Doctor Who over the years, but I wrote a lot of fanzine stuff about Doctor Who in the 1990s, and probably said most of what I want to say there. And I'm not ashamed to write about Doctor Who academically, but there's other things that I'm sort of identified with. I do now and again. I wrote a piece about neo-medievalism and Doctor Who, for instance, for an American collection once. So I don't have a problem with writing about Doctor Who, but I thought, let's get a couple of others out of the way first. And then I just realised this kind of solved all of those things. Also, I'm genuinely interested in adventure in space and time itself, and I'm a total obsessive about the Hartnell era, so it just seemed a win-win situation.
Yeah, because I think there's a fascinating world, like the whole docudrama genre in its own right is fascinating, with how far do you go, how far do you stray from the truth and dramatise things to make it more sellable, in inverted commas. I think that's something that you're definitely fascinated by.
Yeah, there's a lot, watching it as a fan, kind of, it really makes you even more, I think hopefully people who read the book will feel the same way, that it kind of really gives you an insight into how docudrama works when you know something so thoroughly that we kind of all do. We've all read, House, Dammers and Walkers, the 60s, and the first Doctor Handbook, and all those brilliant things in Doctor Who magazine in the early 1990s, the great Andrew Pixley, Marcus Hearn, all that stuff. So we feel that we know the origin story really well, so it's kind of really obvious to a lot of fans, wait a minute, where's Donald Wilson, where's David Whittaker, and all that. So I think there's quite a few fans who kind of had that encounter with it as well, of not thinking, well, these people don't know what they're talking about, but think, that's a really interesting way of telling that story, bearing in mind the amount of a composite and characters having to be put together. Mervyn Pinfield serving this really important structural role, so he's constantly in the docudrama in scenes that he wouldn't have been in real life, but he kind of embodies several people kind of collectively. So hopefully people have had that relationship with it. I did see some negative stuff online at the time in terms of an adventure in space and time, and Caroline Katz's, I think, magnificent Delia Derbyshire piece for Arena. And I think in both cases they're kind of, as I say in the book, a sort of creative conversation with their subject, really.
It's a fascinating way. In fact, you look at you discuss the use of linking captions, those scene setters, as you said, right at the top. And I think that sort of brings things along quite nicely, just sort of to put you in the frame and just to help you how time's passing when, of course, perhaps things maybe didn't quite go at the speed at which they are here, but it's still the shorthand of it, I think, is interesting.
Yeah. There certainly sort of things chronologically are kind of changed as you'd expect. And most disclaimers at the start of docudramas make that point. That they're going to be, they tend to say something along the lines of, this is based on a true story, this is based on researched events and interviews and everything, but for dramatic purposes we've had to change some of the chronology, some of the character names and so on. So yeah, there's definitely moments where that happens, but yeah, they kind of use a version of the TARDIS console to make it look like it's kind of travelling in time once a year. But yeah, there's loads of, that's what I felt when I revisited it, just observing the skill, really, the shape of it, the structure of it, the kind of repeated press calls. So again, instead of saying, well, that there wasn't a kind of regular Doctor Who press call for a new companion standing, in the donut at the BBC, but it's the repetition of those. Visually, they look the same whenever there's this press call for a new companion. So the similarities draw attention to differences. Kind of the first one, there's 5 of them all looking at the camera, really engaged and happy, and Verity's in the middle of it. By the end, William Hartnell looks very distracted, and it seems to be interchangeable companions. Now, that's not true, obviously, because he knew Peter Purves really well, and Peter Purves was in the programme for a year. But that kind of structural repetition is a way of condensing a lot of things. Obviously, if you know a lot about Doctor Who, then it's a little bit strange to have a story that goes, well, here's Verity Lambert, and then Verity Lambert left. Well, who was the next producer? All of that is kind of elided a little bit, but it's structurally really sound. I mean, on that, something I should have done more with, actually, was, and it was only revisiting it for this book, did I realise just how important King Lear was to it. So, obviously, William Hartnell, in a conversation with Sidney Newman, says towards the end, "Fortune, good night, smile once more, turn thy wheel." King Lear, Act 2, Scene 3. And it looks like, well, there's a kind of parallel there with Lear in terms of kind of decline and everything. But then I sort of realised in the last couple of shots after Matt Smith appears, Hartnell smiles, and then the kind of the top of the console turns, and it's like, smile once more, turn thy wheel. I mean, it's even there visually. And I think probably I should have done more with King Lear. I mean, earlier in Act 2 of King Lear, the Earl of Kent uses the phrase sincere verity, and surely I should have used that somewhere. A chapter title or just an aside or something. But I hadn't quite realised that until I sort of revisited it.
I mean, I think you sum it up perfectly what I just said there earlier was docudrama as a hybrid which combines the languages of drama and documentary, often to dramatise research, thereby stimulating interest in issues and events through empathy with characters and narrative. And very much that leads to increasing audience research and potential social impact. And I think that's the thing, that this is very much an emotional piece as well as a factual piece. And I think David Bradley's performance throughout is a very, very subtle performance, particularly, as you say, when you've gone from the photo shoot with 5 of them to the fact there's just 3 in his last one.
Yeah, and Bradley said himself in interviews at the time, he said it's a biopic of William Hartnell, but it's also a biopic of Doctor Who, and perhaps that balance is a bit difficult for it at times. I think probably the middle section of it, kind of obviously trying to, as a fan and as a writer, kind of Matt Gatiss trying to really write a little love letter to Doctor Who and the kind of creativity at the start. Obviously, a really brutal rewrite would just focus on Hartnell. But instead there's lots of kind of nice detail there about the development of it and the success of it and everything else, as well as what it meant for Hartnell. But yeah, Bradley's very good in it. And also he's spoken about just how brilliant Hartnell is. Actually, something I underexplored is, I underexplored the music of An Adventure in Space and Time. That's one of the casualties of reducing the word count. But also there's the scene in which Waris Hussein and Verity Lambert sell Hartnell the concept of Doctor Who. Bradley in that, I mean, it's like a little episode of Doctor Who. It kind of, you get the sort of the title music of Doctor Who at the beginning and end, and in between, Bradley kind of embodies Hartnell from the early section of the docudrama and becomes interesting. And by the end, he's already playing the Doctor before he says yes to the part. And some of its like physical facial expressions, and you can see the Hartnell finding the character and Bradley finding the character of Hartnell finding the character. It's a lovely job.
Yeah, very much so. So tell us about your research for this, because as always with the Black Archive, there are some incredible references being quoted from such a diverse number of places.
Yeah, I did go to the BBC Written Archives Centre back when I was researching the Time Meddler, just in case. And I did look cause at one point in the book, I talk about the difficulties of researching ephemera, so trails and everything. If you want to talk about Doctor Who in 1970, you can talk about what was on the programme on before Doctor Who, the programme was on after it, or Play for Today, the same thing. But if you want to really engage with how people watched it on the night, well, what trail was on before it? What was the continuity saying before it? To find that out, one of the ways of doing that is to go to the BBC Written Archives Centre and the programme's broadcast file and everything. So I actually did that a little bit, and originally that discussion was much longer in the book, and I did actually use archival documents to do that, and also explored some of the stories and kind of, especially Lime Grove. I looked at a lot of archival material on the history of complaints about Lime Grove preceding Doctor Who, and ultimately I didn't use any of it. There isn't a single archive document in this book. Once I started really engaging with what the programme does on screen in relation to those things, I just didn't think they weren't kind of needed so much anymore. But it was a long process. I mean, originally I started writing this book properly in autumn 2019. And at that stage, it was going to be 3 10,000-word chapters because I was totally going to keep the book on length at that point. And I wrote chapter 3 in autumn 2019. It's like a third done. And obviously what happened then was COVID and various other things happened. By the time I came back to it properly in sort of 2024, 25, where I really worked relentlessly on it, I'd done bits in the meantime. By then it was like a 17-chapter version, which is now 15 chapters. So I worked on it quite a lot then, and then in 2026 as well. It's one of those, I mean, to think about the research, you have to sort of think about, when does a book start? So the obvious answer is what I've just said, kind of autumn 2019, but then you kind of think, the gestation of ideas and stuff, how far back do you go? So some of the discussion of counterfactual history I did at university in the 1990s when I studied history. In fact, I nicked some of my old essay for a couple of sentences. Docudrama, I've been doing that for a long time. I wrote a lot of the Screen Online section for that 20 years ago, and I've published various articles and stuff about it. The branding and promotional screen culture stuff, again, I kind of knew about, but I wanted to explore with this in mind. So I had some leads that I wanted to explore. Again, when watching An Adventure in Space and Time, I thought, that's interesting in terms of that thing I know a little bit about. Let's go find out a lot more about it, especially branding and idents and so on. But how far do you take it? Because I realised the first ever fanzine article I wrote about Doctor Who was about Hartnell. I started writing for fanzines like 93, 94. Originally setting a pattern that continued for a long time. I didn't really write about Doctor Who for Doctor Who fanzines. There were a few of us in the 90s who would get asked, could you write us a Doctor Who article? And you go, yeah, can I write something about Primal Scream first? There was a lot of that about at the time.
Oh yes, I remember it well.
But which is great, because I mean, I recommend it to anybody who kind of wants to learn how to write. I mean, writing for an audience, and when you've laid an egg on an unsuspecting audience, they let you know about it in the letters columns. But kind of finding that through doing. But the first fanzine I wrote for was Circus, Colin Brockhurst's mighty fanzine.
Brilliant piece of work from Colin.
Yeah, that started in issue 2. But the first Doctor Who thing, I think the first article I wrote for Colin was on Ab Fab. But the first Doctor Who fanzine piece was for John Connors. I think the last issue of Top, I think. But it was a piece about the gunfighters. So that came out in early 95. I thought I was being really original. Like, I thought, well, fandom hates the gunfighters and they're wrong. So I'm going to rehabilitate the gunfighters. I mean, I realise now that had already started before 95, but 94, 95 people were already doing that. I think the lesson of my first few years in fanzines was I don't know enough. I don't know how to research. I don't necessarily know how to write and structure. I hadn't got the craft yet. But then around 95, 96, for Colin actually, for Circus, I wrote a piece about Hartnell's second season, and I called that Space Helmets for Cows, a much borrowed title since then. I bet I want first. But also I wrote a piece about the Romans. Now, I remember the last 3 lines of that article because I revisited that piece. I was thinking of quoting it in the book, but I didn't in the end. The last 3 lines of my piece on the Romans from, I think it was John Connors, I think it was Faze. The last 3 lines were, just watch Hartnell, don't take your eyes off him, then fill those poles in. Because I was kind of annoyed that in Doctor Who magazine polls, Hartnell didn't kind of feature very sort of highly. And I thought in the Romans, it's an astonishing performance. Kind of, you give Hartnell comedy and you can just see the craft.
Yeah, that sword fight in the bedroom is just brilliant, where he's just having the time of his life, chuckling away to himself.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last chapter of this book, I do allow myself a paragraph or so of just looking at just writing a little love letter to Hartnell across that whole era, just the range and the sheer volume of it. Nobody ever had to make as much Doctor Who as he did. So I suppose this book in a way pays off on things that I started doing in fanzines kind of in 1993, 94. So in terms of research, I think a lot of it's just been kind of thinking and sort of feeling about it for a very long time. So anyone could have predicted that I'd end up doing a Hartnell, but probably not that I'd try to do the whole era all in one book.
No, it's definitely Hartnell adjacent, if you want to use any term. I think that I love the fact you go into a whole discussion about the use of graphics and the imitation ident with the 1963 BBC Globe, which is just a fascinating discussion and looking at it and its revamps over the years.
Yeah, it's just one of those things that certainly for those, I became a fan really a bit late. I was 12 when the McCoy era started, and it was when I sort of started with Doctor Who properly. It wasn't for me, I don't think, before then. So it ended at just the right time, just as I was getting into it. But I wouldn't have been a fan. I wrote about a piece about this in Warp a couple of years ago. The release of the VHS of An Unearthly Child in 1990 and watching that really made me a fan, and all that great writing about the early days that happened, as I say, House, Dammers and Walker and Doctor Who magazine. The problem with the fact that we were all watching it on video is you're watching it in isolation. So you press play, and obviously you get the BBC logo, BBC World logo and everything. But suddenly you're watching it as kind of isolated sort of text. But that isn't how most of us have watched Doctor Who for most of our lives. It's on BBC One, and you kind of watch the last few minutes of Strictly, unless you watch Strictly all the way through. And you experience that as part of a schedule. And certainly if you look at Heaven Sent, the Capaldi episode, the first shot of Heaven Sent, the kind of centred circle, the kind of lens flare effect, is having a really strong chat with the way that the BBC circles idents worked at that time. You would think that the ident was the first shot of the episode. They're just having visually the correspondences are so strong. And if you kind of go through it, again, watching the McCoy era, where the BBC Globe was in the late 1980s, where it is in the frame, and then the kind of shower of sparks of the start of the McCoy era title sequence, it kind of explodes out of the globe. And you sort of realise that it has been folded into a schedule. So we talk about kind of paratexts, things that circle around text. And that can be gossip, it can be magazine pieces and everything else, but it can also be a title sequence, and it can be the ident going into an episode, and it is part of how we've all watched Doctor Who. And television in general, Doctor Who isn't, An Adventure in Space and Time isn't the only programme to do this. EastEnders did it for its anniversary quite recently, of using an original kind of 1986 Globe and so on. It is part of how you experience it as part of a schedule and of linear television. But also there are kind of paratexts associated with streamers as well. It's still a really relevant sort of topic. But I think, I look back in horror at the first few episodes of Doctor Who I recorded, where I actually cut out the continuity to try to get a nice clean edit, so it felt like a video, and that was just silly because it moves away from the whole point of having recorded it.
Yeah, completely, absolutely. I was the same, just to make it flow like the BBC videos did. And I remember my cliffhanger for Silver Nemesis episode 1. What are they? And then it just goes straight in because the word Cybermen had been cut out because the video had rolled itself back, and agony back in the day. But something I really enjoyed was the parallel between Verity Lambert and Valentina Tereshkova as the first woman in space. And what a fantastic sort of way of looking at things, these two explorers, or women in what had been a man's world, and really good in-depth look at that.
Yeah, again, it's a skillful alteration of chronology, and I won't go into that now, but I go into that in quite a lot of detail in the book in terms of whether the dates lined up and stuff. The fact is that Verity Lambert did get a call around the time that happened, so Mark Gatiss there draws a little bit parallel there, and also kind of the way that shot and cut really builds into that. I could have done more with that kind of parallel. Sidney Newman, when he was talking about a programme called The Man Out There, said, and I've got this in front of me, The Man Out There was on air at exactly the same time as Yuri Gagarin was circling the world. And this is going to be a footnote for a while. Actually, those don't work out. that parallel doesn't work out if you kind of look at the history. But, pop. Lovely storytelling. But that parallel, it was there a lot in kind of Doctor Who magazine as well. As I said, in the early 1990s. I know Marcus Hearn used that the BBC were ready to launch and everything else around that time. It's fascinating, that whole period, any sort of any mention of space or space travel in that period, given what was going on, given all of the innovation that was happening in real life, adds a real element to that. And especially later on, when you get to the Ambassadors of Death, that's somebody else's Black Archive, so I'll stop there. But the kind of parallels between what Doctor Who was doing and what's happening in terms of the moon landings and everything, kind of really interesting. But yes, Verity Lambert and Valentina Tereshkova, and that parallel. Obviously, to argue that Verity Lambert was the first producer at the BBC is not quite the case, and to argue that she was the first producer in BBC drama, it depends upon how you interpret the title of producer, because producer used to mean director. So there were women producers at the BBC before that, but not in the new role that Sidney Newman kind of created through his restructuring. So there's lots of asterisks involved. But yeah, I think it's a really lovely parallel that the docudrama creates. So I wanted to kind of try and do that a little bit of justice, kind of go into the history of that a little bit.
And I think you had some fun discussing the creation of the Daleks and the BEM discussion.
Yeah, because it's a phrase that has been used a lot, that Sidney Newman used a lot in interviews and everything. But obviously, fans will know if you kind of trace it back far enough. It was part of a lot of the documents, for very early documents in the development of Doctor Who. And yeah, it's kind of a great streamlining of a very long, complicated process of creating the series, and even the confrontation between Verity Lambert and Sidney Newman about them, in which she defends it. Defends the Daleks and says they're going to be an absolute knockout, which is itself a reference back to what Donald Wilson said when he complained about Radio Times not promoting Doctor Who. He said it's an absolute knockout that'll run and run. There's loads of those little touches. I won't say kisses to the past, but there's loads of those little touches all the way through it. So yeah, that BEM discussion really picked up on that.
You also note in Chapter 11, We'd Be Here All Day, looking at some of the people who didn't make it and why they didn't make it in.
Yeah, I thought that was important. And certainly not bemoaning their absence. I'm trying to sort of look at the solutions that the programme found. But yeah, I sort of did that through the file that Sidney Newman kind of held. There was an idea that Mark Gatiss had originally that there would be a shot, tracking shot of Sidney Newman walking down a corridor with lots of people around him who all throw in different ideas, and there'll be captions saying who everybody is to make sure everyone kind of gets credit. And it ends up being this really lovely kind of, it's not an in-joke, but it's a lovely kind of acknowledgement of the docudrama process, where Verity says to William Hartnell, lots of people were in at the birth of this thing, but if I named them, we'd be here all day. Kind of just acknowledging, really. There's a lot of that kind of acknowledgement to a fan audience. The fact that the disclaimer at the beginning says, you can't rewrite history, not one line. At no point does it explain that that's a quotation from the Aztecs. At no point does it say that in itself is a Doctor Who reference. So there's a lot of that kind of, if you like, referencing sort of to the fans in it.
Yeah, and similarly, the sense of wonder about the TARDIS set and how it's created, and there's that sense of wonder and joy about it all. I think there's something glorious about that. Just obviously, there's no way that Peter Bukaki would have just gone, there you go, but it makes it something funny out of something that probably would have taken a long time to do.
Yeah, it's a really interesting balance that the programme finds, because on the one hand, they're saying the conditions in which people were working in Lime Grove Studio D were not appropriate for this sort of drama. The BBC did have world-leading, cutting-edge technology when Doctor Who was made. It's just that Doctor Who wasn't allocated it. It wasn't a priority. So it's on the one hand saying this was a really challenging environment to work in, but on the other hand talking about the magic that they created. So the first time the docudrama moves onto the TARDIS set, it's not simply actor goes onto the set. There's this tracking shot following Hartnell in there, and there's a kind of Spielberg kind of pause, the kind of moment of wonder, and the music rises, as if the Doctor has walked onto the TARDIS, even though the microphones and everything are in shot to show that it's a studio. And the same thing happens when finally, as you said, the designer delivers the design, and there's this lovely match dissolve from the design into the results of that design in the studio, again presented as a sense of wonder. It's kind of sense of, well, we're showing the difficulties and the challenges, but what they did with that is actually wonderful. And it's a really interesting 50th anniversary balance to have. It's not simply saying, well, this looks a bit tatty because of there were various issues with it, although they're acknowledged. It's yes, but it's magical. And that's a really difficult balance to get. And I think on the whole, it works really well.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that, when you're going into all the discussion about the creation of that, is something that intrigued me, because back in January 2013, I discovered via friends that the Daleks and the TARDIS prop had been made in Glasgow. And myself, my wife and my daughter went in to see the Daleks being built. And Paul McNamara, turns out, who was building the Daleks, lived 2 streets away from me. Complete coincidence. And Katie, my daughter, she would have been not quite 7, and she was all excited about, I'm going to go and see the Daleks. And she walked around the corner and she saw them and she screamed. Just absolute, genuine terror at seeing real Daleks. Only one of them was completely finished and the others were in a state of construction. But it was amazing just to see that effect that, Daleks still had in 7-year-olds or near 7-year-olds, abject terror. And Paul was delighted. He was laughing away, obviously not to Katie's face because she was in genuine fear and crying. But it's amazing to sort of that. And I think that you've sort of captured some of that in there, just with the excitement and how everything came together, putting it together bit by bit like that.
That's lovely. It's a lovely story. And also it's added to my pile of things that I think should have been in the book, which obviously as soon as you finish any piece of writing, I mean, nothing's ever finished. You just have to hand it in. Just constantly, I've moved past the stage of missing the things that I cut out, but there are things I think I could have done more with that, So thank you. That's another thing I'll add to that list. It's a lovely story. I mean, some of the stuff I cut out was just kind of self-indulgent. For example, Pop Pop Pop. I said more about that originally and looked at that and the kind of Hollywood side of that. But also, I think I got this from Martin Wiggins, something that he wrote. The actor David McAllister, when they were doing the Stones of Blood, when he was operating the MacGyver lights, he kept saying pop, pop, pop. And I thought, I'm having that. And that was in the book for a long time. But I thought that's a bit self-indulgent. The most self-indulgent thing I cut, and I'm saying this to shame myself, I'm naming and shaming myself, is in the section which I talk about kind of docudrama paratext. So Nolly has a spin-off documentary called The Real Nolly, and there's The Real Spies Amongst Friends. There was a footnote that said, The Real Ghostbusters is not part of this cycle. That's the sort of thing that I cut out.
I know that's the thing, sort of things you'd love to be able to include with
in that
hindsight.
Case, it was more because of the turn. I thought that I'm a great believer that if you have to explain something complex, you should let it breathe. So you need to spend a lot of time on it and let people get used to it. Because if you're going to talk about docudrama or documentary, there are a couple of words such as indexicality that can sound quite intimidating. But once you realise what they help you to do, you kind of relax. But because of the restructuring, some of that happens in the introduction. I thought that might be a bit too soon, because the introduction used to be really short and breezy. So I wanted to make sure that there was lots of lightness in the book as well, sort of to help people to kind of carry on with it. But I think probably the jokes had to go. There's lightness, and then there's kind of self-indulgence.
Yeah, as it goes on, it's you're absolutely, the attention to detail is fantastic, and really enjoyed it. Just picking up in small little bits here and there, just and fully exploring them, which is the sort of thing that I as a fan like, and that's what the Black Archive does to absolute perfection. So I do thank you for that. So did you have a personal highlight from bringing this all together and discover anything that particularly surprised you?
Well, the King Lear thing surprised me when I realised that I'd missed it the first time. I hadn't missed it, but I didn't realise just how important it was. My favourite bit is Chapter 7, You Can't Rewrite History, which is really about looking at that disclaimer, you can't rewrite history, not one line, and just thinking, what is that? That's a bit cheeky, starting a docudrama with that, because there has to be compositing. It's an acknowledgement there's going to be compositing. I think it's Graham Kibble-White said the kind of necessary cuts and fixes in his Doctor Who magazine review. So I kind of looked at that, what that does at the beginning. So I had to go back to the Aztecs and sort of say, well, obviously it's quotation from the Aztecs. So I went back to that story. There's already been a Black Archive on the Aztecs. So Sidney Newman in An Adventure in Space and Time says, we want history, proper history for the kids at home. So I thought, I've got to settle this. Barbara is a history teacher and an historian who then travels in time in Doctor Who, and they have that debate, that discussion, say, in the Aztecs during the first series. So what does it do in the Aztecs, and what does it do in Adventure in Space and Time? So I sort of looked at what were kids learning at school at the time. Now, Doctor Who fans have done this before. It's been discussed in a few sources. What kids were learning. So we all know that a lot of the topics for history stories in the first 2 or 3 series of Doctor Who map perfectly onto what the core periods of history were in school teaching. So in terms of what they were learning at school, we're okay with that. But I wanted to ask, how were they learning? How were they taught? What sort of teaching would Barbara have been doing, and how would she have been thinking as an historian? So I looked into the ways in which, amazingly, for about 20 years after the Second World War, governments didn't impose a syllabus. They gave advice, but they didn't impose a syllabus. But a lot of it was to do with creativity and kind of short, kind of 30-minute bursts, and also the patch method in which kids would imaginatively live in a historical period for a certain number of weeks. And I thought, this sounds like Doctor Who. So I kind of explored this. But also, what would Barbara, as an historian, have been reading? Well, E.H. Carr's What is History was a set of lectures on BBC Radio in 1961 and a book. And I say during the book, when we see in the finished broadcast version of An Unearthly Child, Susan's reading a history book, the surprise is that it's the French Revolution and that it in What is History. But the discussions that David Whittaker, not in the docudrama, had with viewers and with writers about whether the Doctor could change time, the parallels with What is History are really, really strong. So I tried to explore, see Barbara as a version of the monk in The Time Meddler, who the Doctor says he must be stopped. Of course, he's had that conversation already with Barbara. So would that plan have worked? What is her plan based on in terms of her understanding of history and the role of the historian and everything else? So that chapter, that could have been a book, to be honest, because there's quite a lot. You could really explore the whole of Doctor Who's relationship with history in kind of history stories. But I looked at that and then thought about what that statement does at the start of An Adventure in Space and Time. This isn't a standard based on a true story, although it does lots of the same sorts of things. But if you're going to have a callback to something that fans recognise as being that specific debate with the Doctor, kind of what does it do? And it's a really rich, slightly cheeky way to start. And it's one of my favourite bits of the whole docudrama. And yeah, chapter 7 is the one that, probably the most standalone chapter in the book. It's the one that I really learned a lot from although I was going back to counterfactual history and what ifs, which I'd studied kind of in the 90s. I updated it and I learnt a lot more about it and a lot more about teaching in a way that would have possibly shaped how kids responded to Doctor Who when they were watching it at the time.
This is a fantastic read. It goes into depth in the way that fans like, the way that I enjoy, and I have to say I heartily recommend it. And there might be a couple of copies being purchased to give as Christmas presents to people further down the line. So I thank you for your amazing work on this, David. It really is an absolute bonus because I was not expecting this to be done in the Black Archive range. So the fact is it has been absolutely brilliant. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
So fingers crossed that there will be perhaps something else from the future. If you could pick one Black Archive to do a story on that hasn't been done, what would you go for? But this is no way in any way committing yourself.
Well, I mean, I'd have to pitch for it like everybody else and could easily get rejected. I did always want to do The Time Meddler, but I think this book is that, and certainly chapter 7 is that. I'd have to repeat that in a book on The Time Meddler. I'd love to do The Gunfighters. I'd basically, between every chapter, I'd write a new verse for The Ballad of the Last Chance Saloon. But also, it was the first thing I ever wrote for a fanzine, like in 1994, 95. It'd be good to kind of come full circle. I said Remembrance of the Daleks because of there are parallels there in terms of the rise of the far right. But also, it would work as a really nice sequel to John Hill's Sex, Class and Realism, British Cinema, 1956-1963. That would be a really exciting book to write. So there's quite a few of that sort. I mean, luckily, a lot of stories have already been taken, or the answer to this question was gone for about another hour.
Well, David, a massive thanks to you for your time and really appreciate it. And well, fingers crossed, there could be something on the Gunfighters. I know I'd buy it. They're fantastic.
You're very, very welcome. Thank you very much.
So there we go. Huge thanks to David for his time there. If you want to get your hands on a copy, the book is available as a downloadable PDF version, and you can also order a physical copy from Obverse. You can get a copy at www.obverse.co.uk/product/an-adventure-in-space-and-time/ But I'm sure if you just Google it, or any other search engine it, you'll be able to find it. And of course, if you want to know a bit more about David's work, he has his own website, British Television Drama, and you can visit that at www.britishtelevisiondrama.org.uk. Of course, there's still some more Black Archives to be featured, as we're a little behind here on The Power of Three, because back in June, The Web Planet by Bridget Cherry was released. In August next month, The Invasion by Steve Hatcher is on his way. Steve, of course, many of you may know as one of the people behind the fantastic Hooverville conventions. And then out in October we have Frontiers from Paul Driscoll. So some fantastic stories in there, and I'm looking forward to reading them all. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, feel free to leave a review for us wherever you get your podcasts from. You can follow us on social media. We are at Power of 3 Pod with a number 3 on Twitter. We are at Finished Zine on Blue Sky, and we have a Facebook group as well. So feel free to leave any comments in there if you've enjoyed this episode. So now it's time to go, and we'll finish with a song. So why don't we go with one that was hugely popular back in 1963. It's of course Three Guitars Mood 2, which of course was played by John Smith and the Common Men. Of course, we know it wasn't really by John Smith and the Common Men, it was by Nelson and Raymond, or the Arthur Nelson Group. So we'll let them play us out. Until next time, I've been Kenny Smith. Bye bye.